Welcome back to Stop the Takes. I'm Dakota, that is Austin, and today we are discussing the Pro Football Hall of Fame, um, breaking down everything from recent inductees, the state of the Hall of Fame in general, and then our thoughts on what we would do to improve it, who would make it in for us, and so on. So we have had a ton of these conversations offline, Austin, a ton.
Yep.
And they're always a blast. So it's fun to be able to do this on the show now. Um, what are your immediate thoughts on talking and breaking down the Hall of Fame, and what are you most looking forward to kind of chatting through?
I think the thing I'm most looking forward to is individual players and some of their cases, but yeah, I think the Hall of Fame is watered down at this point. I think a lot of people feel that way. A lot of the players that are the greatest in NFL history feel that way. Now the kind of lower level Hall of Famers definitely don't feel that way because being in the Hall of Fame is a huge deal, man. Like it's really cool to see a player get inducted. It's really cool when they go do the knock on the door and the player gets the news that he's going to get in the Hall of Fame. All that's really cool. And it's not, and we're gonna make the case that some of these guys shouldn't be in, but it doesn't mean they're not good players. Like
Right.
there's a lot of good to great players in the Hall of Fame, but to me, generally speaking, the Hall of Fame should be for the best of the best. It should be for the greatest players to ever play. And so yeah, that's simply my view on the Hall of Fame. It should be for the best players in NFL history. And I think it's become less than that. It's become guys who were good. And it's more towards, I think they look a lot at longevity. Whereas I would look less at longevity. I think longevity doesn't matter as much as peak.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think to kind of summarize that too is like we've referred to it as it's no longer becoming like the Hall of Fame. It's kind of the Hall of the Very Good. And for our criteria of what it takes to be a Hall of Famer, it tends to me you have to have been the best to play the game of football. And part of that's due to the way that the voting has worked over time of, you know, backlogging a lot of guys that weren't able to make it in because the Hall of Fame didn't exist until the late 60s. And a lot of guys had already played up until that point and had full careers and been out of the league. So there was a lot of backdating. But then as the league expanded and you started to see even better players, it started to come, a hodgepodge of we got to get the guys who are now retiring in, plus the guys who were from the past that never made it in, which then started to raise questions, in my opinion, around, well, did all those guys deserve to get in? Like at the time, and it's where it's tough with, weighing that time period and what that player was, but also the grand scheme of just everybody who have now played in the NFL and where you rank in terms of your greatness and the impact you had on the game. So with that in mind, let's jump right into just talking about, you know, the current state of the Hall of Fame. So, let's start by looking at these last few inductee classes. So, the one for this year hasn't gone in yet. So the class of 2025 has been selected, but they're technically not in until in August when they have the Hall of Fame games when that ceremony all happens around that time. But there is only four guys that are getting inducted this year, where we've consistently kind of had around 7 to 8 for the last few years, besides 2020.
Yeah, so that's a good change they made. They have kind of gone away with the historical inductee. I think they got a ton of guys in, and it's really cool for them and their families and stuff. Guys who had big impacts on the game, but again, probably wouldn't make the Hall of Fame if it were truly the greatest to ever play. Because, like you said, they had a backlog, and it made sense at first to do what they did, but then they kind of let that go for a long time, and then they dumped a ton of people in 2020, but now they've cut it to four guys this past season, which I appreciated. Um, did they get the four guys right? I don't know. That's a little debatable. But they are at least cutting the amount of players that are getting in, which I think will help make it feel less watered down. And they especially need to do that now, man, with how stats are going to look different. Like
Hmm.
for example, in baseball, they have like hardcore stat cutoffs. Like if you reach this threshold, you're a Hall of Famer. And they haven't really gone off that. Football, it cannot be that. especially when we're looking at offensive stats or even defensive stats when it comes to sacks and interceptions and things like that. You can't just purely look at stats because the game is so much different than it was 50 years ago. The game has evolved so much, and it's obviously more pass heavy. Everyone knows that. So you can't look at things like receiver stats or passing yards and things like that. So I think it's good that they're making it more difficult to get in, because there's going to be some guys, some modern guys that, okay, their stats look like they're Hall of Fame worthy when you compare them to a guy who played in the 70s. But it's like you have to adjust for air. And so I think what they're doing now is going to help with that a little bit, which is good. That's a good change.
Yeah, and I think there's the obvious positions that impacts pretty heavily. And we just wrapped up our discussion on the all quarter century team that ESPN did, and we obviously shared our thoughts on some guys on there. One of those being a recent inductee. And our show is obviously all about stopping the takes, but some of our opinions on this may feel a little hot takey just because, especially for me, like I am a bit harsh on who I would put in. Um, and more specifically, who gets in on the first ballot. But what the position, that I'm referring to is wide receiver, right? So, guys like current guys that are, in the league that people tend to hype up, and we already start proclaiming them as future Hall of Famers and stuff. And we'll touch on those a little bit later. But like in the most recent class in 2024, when Andre Johnson got in, um, and, I may have put him in eventually, but he is a product of his era. And when comparing him to guys, like you getting at like the guys in the 70s and 80s whose stats, they're not going to be the top 10, top 15 on the all-time list anymore. But what they achieved in their era, I would argue, is more impressive than what some did in today's era, just because of the inflation of stats around the passing league. So, that's a key portion for me, is in isolating what happened in an era. And honestly, in some ways, it's almost the reverse for like running backs now, where it's like if you are having an exceptional career as a running back now and in the last 20 years in the pass heavy league, it's almost more impressive, whereas back in the day, running backs were dominating the NFL and having a better passing career seemed to inflate things.
Yeah, it's interesting because you point out a guy like Andre Johnson. It's like, well, should Andre Johnson be in the Hall of Fame if we're going off the current criteria? Sure, but that's kind of where it gets convoluted, because it's like when we're having Hall of Fame discussions, I think it's only interesting if we say, okay, should Andre Johnson get into our Hall of Fame? What we think the Hall of Fame should
Right.
look like, because that, again, it's like, yes, we're not kicking guys out or anything like that. We can't do that. And there are a lot of guys in that shouldn't be in, into our criteria. So yes, of course, Andre Johnson should make that state of the Hall of Fame, but that's not what we're really talking about. We're talking about should they be in the Hall of Fame that we feel like is, what a true Hall of Fame should be, which is the greatest players of all time. And that's, again, that's not really what the Hall of Fame is at this point.
Mhm.
And yeah, and he's an interesting case. He's a guy that I was going to touch on as well. Again, I think stats, like you said, for receivers especially, it's like there used to be thresholds, right? It used to be like 10,000 yards. Okay, 10,000 yards is a threshold that people hit for the Hall of Fame. Like if you go look at Hall of Fame receivers, a lot of them will meet that threshold. Um, I don't think you can use that threshold anymore. It's so much easier, even in Andre Johnson's era, to get to 10,000 yards receiving. It's just so much easier than it was in the 70s. So I think that's a great example of a guy and a position that you just have to be harsher on, right? You have to look more at peak and things like all pros and things like that to determine, okay, was this guy ever the best at his position? Was he truly one of the best at his position during his era?
And you kind of nailed it there. And with the 10,000 mark, it's specifically looking at receivers still, like there are 57 receivers that now have 10,000 yards. And I would just say I don't think 57 wide receivers should be in the Hall of Fame, at that cutoff. And I think, to your point, like it's not saying that, hitting that threshold doesn't mean anything anymore or shouldn't be valued, but it's more of the full body of work and everything else that players do. And I think that gets lost now, especially when more casual fans watch the NFL. And honestly, it seems like voters for both like AP voting and all these things, Heisman voters don't actually watch players anymore and just kind of vote based on statistical or what was said about those players. In some ways, not calling them out for that, but it does feel like that happens some. And the perfect example is like looking at the current all-time wide receiver list in terms of yards, right? Keenan Allen is 40th on that list right now. I would say most people would say Keenan is not a Hall of Famer,
Yeah.
but Tyreek Hill is 42nd. And the difference there is that he's been in the league 3 years less than Keenan Allen. So the achievement of how quickly he's climbed that ladder is much more impressive and will probably be on a trajectory to be a Hall of Famer. So, it's that full bite, and to your point, the all pros and everything else. And like, one thing you and I always talk about that we fully agree on is, were you ever the best at your position any given year? And how often were you top 3 and top 5? Because in my opinion, we can't put somebody into the Hall of Fame if you were never even at the top of your position. Like that, the whole point is these are the best who have ever played the game. And if you were just very good or pretty good for a while, that doesn't cut it for me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that criteria. I think that has to be a part of the criteria, being a top player at your position, and it also matters the position. Like specialist, to me, you have to be the best for a long period of time.
True.
But at wide receiver, you have to be considered a top 3 receiver at some point in your career for, I would say, at least a 3 to 5 year period of time. Being a top 5-ish receiver would be my general criteria for that. One thing though, as far as the status of the Hall of Fame is concerned, I think they are getting better at looking at player peaks, which is important. Like they're getting guys in that, like Terrell Davis, and which he got in quite a while ago, or this past year with Sterling Sharp. Like they're looking at peaks more, which I think matters because to me, again, that kind of fits our criteria, right? Like top 5 player at your position for a peak of time. Those players fit that criteria. They do not fit the longevity criteria. I think the Hall of Fame for a long period of time, and they still do to a certain extent, look too much at longevity, and which is essentially stat accumulation. Because like if you're a solid guard for 15 years, right? You're not going to get in the Hall of Fame unless you had the All Pros, you had the league wide recognition. But if you're a solid wide receiver, and I might be mentioning a guy like Mike Evans in this conversation. If you're a solid wide receiver for 15 years, Dakota, you're getting in the Hall of Fame. Like there is no question about it. In this current state of the Hall of Fame and the history of the Hall of Fame, a solid wide receiver or a solid running back like Frank Gore is getting in the Hall of Fame because of the stat accumulation, which A, is unfair to positions like I just mentioned, like guard or offensive linemen in general, who don't get stat accumulation. And it's just, to me, it's not right to have a Hall of Fame with Frank Gore and Barry Sanders in it. Because the difference of level of player is just, it's too large to me. Like the level of Barry Sanders and Frank Gore is just, it's too wide of a gap to have them in the same place. This is supposed to be football heaven, right? It's literally the best of the best. You just can't have that wide of a gap between players.
Yeah, and it's a very good point on, I think, the state of it currently, and it does seem like they've gotten better. And you're right. Like longevity, I think, is weighed way too highly in the current state. Basically, if you play for a long time, you're probably getting in as at the positions like you mentioned, right? Like where you're accumulating the stats, where people could point to something on paper and say, well, how can this not be in the Hall of Fame? But then on the flip side, to your point too, like a guy like Priest Holmes, who we just talked about on that quarter century team, has not gotten in, probably never will, probably he shouldn't, but he is getting put on all quarter century teams because he had like a very short peak, right? It's a matter of sustained peak, and I do think that the Hall of Fame is, the voters are looking at that as a body of work of your peak. And I think one thing that'll be really fascinating to watch with the current state of the Hall of Fame is how they handle these quarterbacks that are coming up, like
Yep.
the Phillip Rivers of the world. Eli didn't get in first ballot. which
It's a
thank God,
plus.
in my opinion.
Yeah, good job. You
Like
got
that
that
would
one
have been
right.
damning.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, will he get in? In my opinion, I wouldn't, but like it'd be curious to see how the Hall of Fame, because do you win? We're evaluating the current state of it. Like they did the right thing there. Philip Rivers will be up for his first ballot next year,
Mhm.
alongside somebody who will be a first ballot Hall of Famer, Drew Brees. And again, that's another guy that I think would be a polarizing topic for some.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make a fascinating point because the quarterback position is most important position in football, and again another position where, listen, it's easier now than ever to play longer at quarterback. Dakota, they are the most protected position in football as well,
Yes.
and so again that plays into the stat accumulation thing. It's like, okay, these players that were average have accumulated these stats. Like Philip Rivers is one of the best examples of that. I think Eli Manning's case is an interesting one just because Eli is more falls into the bucket of, yes, he has the stats, but he also has that criteria that some people use that I kind of disagree with, which is, can you tell the story of football without this player? And Eli definitely falls into the bucket of, well, you really can't tell the story of the NFL without Eli Manning's historic runs. For one, you upset the 2007 Patriots, which many people believe is the greatest team ever. So that's where we'll kind of debate in our criteria. It's like, how much do you weigh that kind of stuff? Because Eli Manning was truly an average to below average quarterback for 90% of his career. But the 10% where he was above average and he elevated his team led his team to two Super Bowls over Tom Brady's Patriots, which it's like, to me, Eli for that reason has a better case than Philip Rivers. Even though I think overall Philip Rivers was a better quarterback. But again, it comes down to peak. Like that's a very small peak, so it wouldn't get in for me. But Philip Rivers' peak was he was never in the Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Drew Brees,
Mhm.
Aaron Rodgers level of quarterback, or even Big Ben. I always thought Big Ben was a better quarterback than Philip Rivers. So even though he has, again, to your point, the stat accumulation, it's like
Yep.
this current state, it's like, okay, are we going to look at Philip Rivers' touchdown interception ratio over guys like Terry Bradshaw? It's like, well, that would be a terrible comparison. I mean, the game is completely different. And I don't even know their stats. I don't even have their stats pulled up, but that's the kind of things that's like, especially younger fans who didn't even grow up watching a guy like Philip Rivers like we did.
Right.
And then you got the older fans who actually grew up watching a guy like Terry Bradshaw, knowing that at the time he played, he was the best quarterback in the NFL. And that's kind of the interesting debate, man. I mean, that's like kind of what we're getting into, and like trying to tie down, okay, what specifically should be the criteria for a Hall of Fame?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting segue to with the quarterback stuff around accolades, and how much that in the history of the Hall of Fame has kind of carried a weight, specifically team achievement, right? Individual accolades are really easy to accumulate, but from quarterbacks, they've definitely been aided by the fact that they won Super Bowls, when we weirdly associate that very highly to the quarterbacks themselves and less so to like the team. Um, and a guy that I will always pinpoint as an example of that is Troy Aikman,
Yeah.
where I just don't think he would be in my Hall of Fame, because unlike a Terry Bradshaw, unlike a Roger Staubach, like in their era, they were literally like you didn't want to play them. Like they were the quarterbacks that were defenses didn't want to see or whatever. And during Aikman's, he had Montana out there and Jim Kelly, like other guys that, and Marino for part of it, that like they were truly the best at their position. The Cowboys just had an absolutely loaded roster that won championships. And when you look at the individual accolades that they're lacking for a guy like Aikman. And I think that translates a little bit into the guy like Philip Rivers we're talking about, where he didn't even have the Super Bowls to back it up, but because of the era he's in, he's currently sixth all time in passing, and there would be a large portion of people
You're like,
probably that would just point at that
that's
and
Hall
say,
of Famer.
yeah. And it's like when you look at the list of like all time passing yards leaders right now, it's pretty eye opening in terms of what the modern era of football has done to this landscape. Where like if we're just looking at the top 20, we'll do top 22. Okay. top 22 would include guys like Derek Carr, Kirk Cousins, Joe
Wow.
Flacco, Russell Wilson, Carson, or sorry, oh yeah, Andy Dalton is 26th, just
Andy
behind
Dalton
Joe
is
Montana,
26th.
just behind Johnny Unitas and Joe Montana.
Wow.
And then Vinny Testaverde's even at 16, which is interesting because he just played for forever. Um, and then you have guys like Matt Ryan at 8, who has more accolades than Philip Rivers, but still, was he the best? No, when he was
Yeah.
playing. So it's just the quarterback ones become fascinating. Matt Stafford at 10, who now has more team accolades again, but not individual ones.
Yeah. I think that's why stats for the large part have to just be kind of thrown out. Um, Especially in the quarterback case, you just can't look at them. The Troy Aikman case is interesting, man. It's
Yeah,
tough
it is.
because it's like I do think he was probably considered one of the best quarterbacks in his era. However, you make a great point. The roster was loaded. It was an absolutely loaded roster. Um, so it is a fascinating case, Aikman in particular, and but again, it's like his stat. You can't really compare his stats because even in that era, it's a lot different than this era. Um,
Right.
so yeah, it's hard because to me, the reason I'm hung up on that is because quarterbacks do have a greater driver for team success. And
True.
they
Yeah.
it's more so now, but it's really always been the case. I mean, you look at the greatest teams in NFL history, it's pretty heavily correlated with the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. It is. So I kind of I agree with you to a certain extent, but it's like Aikman is an interesting case. But I think the more interesting cases are the guys with the stats who have like they were solid. Maybe they got maybe Matt Stafford. He had one good run. He took the Rams to a Super Bowl. But it's like Matt Stafford in his prime, dude, was not even a top 10 quarterback. He was never considered elite at the Lions. And you could say, well, the Lions didn't set him up for success. It's like, yeah, I get that. But you also look at a guy like Peyton Manning who inherited a really bad franchise. Go look at the Colts pre Peyton Manning. It was a crap show, dude. I mean, it was a total crap show. When they moved from Baltimore to Indianapolis, the Colts were genuinely one of the worst franchises in the NFL. And Peyton Manning inherited that. It wasn't a great team. Now like he had Marvin Harris, he had guys, but Matt Stafford had Calvin Johnson. It's like there are certain guys that you have, but the point is that quarterbacks elevate. Quarterbacks elevate. The greatest of all time elevate no matter what the situation is. So quarterbacks interesting. It's hard because I agree with you to a certain extent. It's like you can't just look at team success, but it's also a position where if you're truly great, you will elevate the team because that's how much impact they have. But I don't think they're just looking at that right. Right now, I think it's mostly stat accumulation and like you said, certain accolades that maybe weren't all because of that individual player.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, current Chargers head coach Jim Harbaugh was the quarterback before
Yes,
Peyton showed up.
he was. He
It
was
was a rough,
indeed.
well, along with a couple other guys because it was rotating door on a team that won like 2 games, so tough times. But yeah, and it and to kind of put a bow on the quarterbacks because I'd like to talk a little bit about current state with defense before we move on to just our full ideas and stuff. But it also, to me, makes me focus on, on the wide receiver side, a guy like Steve Largent, where you're putting up these insane stats at an era that was not built for that, like it wasn't a passing league. And then another guy who I think is probably, he's always been one of my favorite guys because he was also one of the first, like, mobile QBs, I would say. Because it's almost gone like on like a bell curve or like a loop where like quarterbacks originally were a bit more mobile in nature because we're moving away from not being able to throw the ball forward. So everybody kind of had to be able
Yeah,
to run a little
they're
bit. You know
they're
what I mean?
basically halfbacks that took the snap.
Exactly. That would try to throw the ball. Yeah.
Yeah.
But my point with that is a guy like Fran Tarkenton,
Hmm.
who is still currently 14th on the all-time passing yards list who played most of his career in the 60s. And
Yeah.
like that is just insane. Like those are the types of things where it's like we need to look more at guys like that and talk about their success and what they did to the game of football, um, rather than Russell Wilson, who's just a few spots behind him, who we've seen his whole career. We know that
Yeah.
he has that many yards from just playing for a while, and like it's yeah.
And
So
that's
yeah,
and that's partly why I think the perception at the time matters. This is something that I've talked to you about, Dakota. I think the perception of the players in the league, people that cover the league, and it's so hard to capture that when you're trying to be
yeah,
a historian of the game. It's tough, especially when there wasn't as much, like there was coverage in the 70s, but you can't go look on YouTube and see what the sports pundits were
yeah,
saying at the time. You just can't do that. So it's harder to know, okay, what was the perception of this player at the time? And I think that does matter because like the perception of again, a guy like Philip Rivers was never the greatest. He was just never considered to be great. And yeah, so I think the perception at the time matters. Like what were players saying about Steve Largent in the 70s? Like what were they
yeah.
saying about guarding him in the 1970s? I think stuff like that would matter, and it's hard to capture. But I think that's the kind of stuff that should go into Hall of Fame criteria. Obviously a guy that's not going to have any trouble getting the Hall of Fame, Aaron Donald. But like when we're talking about GOAT discussion, and I think, we don't care for that kind of stuff, but
Yeah,
it kind of tied into this Hall of Fame conversation partly.
yeah,
When you're talking about stuff like that, like the perception of Aaron Donald matters. Like the stats don't matter. Like you can't look at, okay, how many sacks did Aaron Donald have compared to other defensive tackles or other D linemen in general. You can't look at that. Things that matter more to me are, okay, they literally used to have to take Aaron Donald out of practice in joint training camp just to have practice function. Like that's how dominant he was. Like the NFL top 100 list every year, which it has gotten wonky at times, but the players voted him year after year the best player in the NFL. Like things like that matter. What players say, like how difficult it was to block him, that kind of thing matters when we're talking about Hall of Fame discussion and things of that nature. That I don't know how much of that's actually being taken into criteria right now.
yeah. And again, that kind of leads me into this to the really good segue again onto more of like the defensive side of the ball, which I feel like is almost even harder to evaluate because like sacks weren't even a stat for some people's careers for most of them. Like a Deacon Jones, who was
Yes,
arguably
such
one
a
of the
good example.
best edge rushers of all time or defensive linemen of all time, that we can't even really quantify how good he was because the primary stat we used didn't exist. And I think that with that also comes like the admission of, the guys I claim to know enough about to make a judgment on, but then all the ones that we don't because we didn't have those statistics or enough evidence. And I think for some reason in my mind, because it was one of the first classes I really paid attention to and was in 2013, and Curly Culp, who got in, whose primary career was in the 60s. And it's like, he's a perfect example of that. Like, what were people in the 60s saying about
Same about
Curly?
Curly Culp. Yeah,
What were they saying?
he
Because I want
also
to know.
yeah, exactly. And also took him forever to get in. It's
It
like
did.
again, that's why it comes down to perception thing because it's like, okay, Jim Brown played in the 60s, but Jim Brown's perception was this dude is the hardest guy to tackle ever to play football. And that's the kind of thing that matters. Now, again, Jim Brown's a guy that was a first ballot Hall of Famer, so he didn't have any trouble getting in. But that kind of
Mhm.
stuff should matter when we're talking about guys on the fringe. Like, I don't think Mike Evans struck fear into people, Dakota. I don't think he's ever done that. Whereas Antonio Brown, Calvin Johnson, Julio Jones, guys like that struck fear into the opponent, in my opinion. That was the perception at the time. They were always perceived to be one of the best at their position. But yeah, defense is so interesting, especially those old guys, because it's like
Yeah.
a guy like Deacon. I mean, Deacon Jones changed the rules. Like guys like Deacon Jones and Mel Blount changed the rules and things like that. You can't put on a stat sheet. That's nowhere to be found on a stat sheet, but it should be. That should be part of the criteria to getting into the Hall of Fame. It's like if you change the game of football, which again, it's a touchy-feely thing, but it matters. It's part of the perception. And, like it's interesting because like you bring up the stat stack. It's like Deacon Jones always gets lost in the discussion of who's the greatest edge rusher of all time, or who's the greatest defensive lineman of all time. It's like, well, half his sacks weren't recorded. Some people believe he might hold the record for sacks in a season. That's how dominant he was at times. So I think, again, it goes all back to my point. It's like, even with these defensive guys, what were their perception around the league? Linebackers, an interesting case, dude. Linebackers,
Yeah.
you can't look. Tackles are the most irrelevant stat, I think, in football. Like, I think it's irrelevant. But you look at a guy like Ray Lewis. Like, I would never look at linebackers and say, okay, I'm going to rank who gets in the Hall of Fame based on how many tackles you have. But you look at a guy like Ray Lewis. It's like, who constantly racked up a ton of tackles.
Mm-hmm.
Ray Lewis's perception around the NFL is like, okay, this is one of the scariest dudes to play against in the league. Like, he's one of the scariest dudes to throw against. He's one of the scariest dudes to run it. Like, nobody wanted to play Ray Lewis. And again, not a guy that's struggling to get in the Hall of Fame, but it matters as far as, okay, his perception is he's one of the greatest ever. So he's a slam dunk Hall of Famer. And you should apply that to other linebackers that are getting in, which, again, going back to all pros, dude, and we've talked about how all pros matter more than Pro Bowls. Well, all pros right now are very heavily skewed for linebackers, because right now in the NFL, basically every team in the league have 2 off-ball linebackers that start. Yet,
Yep.
the all-pro criteria for linebacker is 3 get first-team all-pro every year. So to me, when we're looking at the guys we're watching right now in 10 years and we say, damn, this guy has 7 first-team all-pros, that should matter less for a guy that plays wide receiver or edge rusher, who are much more loaded positions that have, they are allowed at the amount that are on the field, unlike middle linebacker, who gets 3, and when there's only 2 on the field at any given time. So those, again, are part of the things that in the current state of the Hall of Fame and the current state of all pros that should definitely be looked at, and that I would look at if I were making a criteria.
Yeah, I think, you bring up a good point with the linebackers, because they're probably one of the best in terms of like the historical, what we knew about, what we felt about them being the thing that kind of put them in the Hall of Fame. Because like you talk about like being feared and whatnot, and it's like everyone knows that the Steelers linebackers, Hammond, Lambert, they were terrified of them.
They're feared.
Terrified of Mike Singletary. But because like everybody was terrified of those dudes, and that's how you created your career off of that. But like to your point too with the tackle thing, because it's been a very consistent thing lately where a lot of the times we'll see dudes get voted, maybe not first team all pro, because again, some positions we just kind of lean into the naming convention of who at a position that people don't pay attention to as much, or quite frankly, don't really know how to evaluate. In a linebacker position, I think is a good modern example of that, to your point, where there's only 2 on the field. Team's usually a nickel, and linebackers are asked to do way more than just stop the run. And a guy like Devin White there for a minute was like seen as a great linebacker, but in reality, he just wasn't. And was it this past season where like, you saw them firsthand, Zaire Franklin and EJ Speed were 2 of the top 3, I think, in tackles. They're not that good linebackers.
They're not good
especially
linebackers.
Speed.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that
is inflating things massively for them.
We literally let one walk in free agency.
Yeah,
you don't let
want
good players walk.
Get out.
Yeah, so that's a great point, man. You have, again, it comes down to the perception, and man, I was blanking on what I was going to say, but yeah, I mean, all pros, and here, I'll get back to what I was going to say. PFF. A lot of people won't like me saying this. PFF is helping these discussions, and they have helped all pro massively, especially at positions. It's harder. It's just harder to evaluate. It's so much harder to evaluate the left guard when we're voting on all pros, which matter heavily for Hall of Fame. That's why we're talking about it. Than it is to evaluate a left guard over a receiver. Which a receiver, it's very obvious. It's like, okay, you're accumulating these stats, you're getting these touchdowns. We're seeing it week after week. Fans aren't watching, and even some of the people that vote on these things aren't heavily watching the left guard. But PFF, whether you agree with the grades or not, okay, they grade every play. And a lot of people's criticism is that they don't know what's going on. They don't know what a given player is supposed to do on a single play. When they're grading an offensive lineman, what they're looking at, which it's not hard to understand. Like, they can understand football. They have football guys. They can understand football. They're grading, okay, did this player make their block or not? Did they win their block or not? And those things, like those players' grade, like offensive line grades, are now heavily uh, influenced and a part of all pro voting. And it should, because beforehand, before a source like PFF existed, what they would do essentially with right tackle for a long time, if you go back and look, and PFF actually did this, the founder of PFF ended up doing this. He went back and looked at for a certain period of time right tackles. The all pro right tackle was always the team with a winning record, like the best teams in the conference. It would just be, okay, who got 12 wins this year? Okay, their right tackle is the all pro. That's it's not right at all. It's like again, that goes back to certain positions. You can't just look at all pro either, because it's like some of those were just wrong. For many years, all pros were just not correct at certain positions. And I think that's one thing that is getting better, that I can say that the state of the Hall of Fame is getting better at, that, all pros are getting more and more accurate, I think, every year.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, I know a lot of people hate PFF, and it is what it is. But like, you know, uh, paid attention to them a lot over the last 6, 7 years or whatever. And I mean, the data they have, I mean, it aligns with a lot of the best players in the league, and it's a valuable resource for other positions as well to just evaluate beyond just statistical output, which is what everybody tends to look at. Just what did a guy do statistically? And at the end of the day, that's the easiest thing for people who don't have the time really to dive into the game and watch individual players on a play-by-play basis. And that's what they do.
Yep.
And that evaluation is, is really helpful. And at a position like linebacker, like you touched on, where really all people look at is tackles. Well, no, how good are they in coverage? Well, I don't really know because I didn't watch them. Well, then PFF has a coverage grade. They could tell you how good they were based on that.
Or corners. I mean, corners like Deron Bland had all those pick sixes a couple years ago. But on a play-by-play basis, Deron Bland wasn't one of the best corners in the league. And now that might upset some people. And listen, a pick six is an extremely valuable play. So that should matter. Like, those things should matter. But on a play-by-play basis, it should matter more, right? Because if you, or maybe Trayvon Diggs is even a better example, that year where he had like 8 picks, but gave up like 1,200 yards. That's an extreme, but point is like, you can get interceptions, but if you're giving up a ton of yardage and touchdowns on top of that, it really kind of balances itself out, and it doesn't matter as much. Like Darrelle Revis in his historic 2009 season, I think he only had like 6 picks, but it was, look at all the pass breakups. It was like he had like 30 something pass breakups, and his assignment was tougher than anyone else's. So those are things that PFF are helpful for. And you don't have to completely agree with their grades, but it's a helpful resource, I think, going forward in these Hall of Fame discussions.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on the Darrelle Revis 2009 thing because you mentioned it in the all quarter, because I just want people to know that don't know or haven't seen that graphic. The receivers that he faced that season is what makes that season one of the best things ever, where he faced Andre Johnson, like in his prime, Randy Moss, T.O., Steve Smith, Reggie Wayne, Chad Ochocinco, Roddy White, among others, and basically shut every single one of them, I think, below 35 yards is what he did. Absolutely insane. So it's like that is one of the biggest peaks in NFL history. And one thing, probably to put a wrap on the current state as we move forward into our criteria stuff, and this is your point with the all pro thing, is that Pro Bowls, in my opinion, completely irrelevant. And I think people historically, they used to matter a little bit more when the voting for them was a bit different. But in the modern era of like looking at Pro Bowls is a useless stat because it's just became a naming convention of who do I know? And the biggest example of that is Marquise Pouncey with PFF. If we didn't have PFF, Marquise Pouncey could still end up as like a Hall of Famer just because of
Hall of Famer.
People's, which is insane. That's the perfect example of where Pro Bowl being used as a stat has just got to start meaning borderline nothing.
And it's not just name recognition is a big part of it. You're right about that, but it's also alternates, Dakota. It's like how many people just sit out the Pro Bowl. That used to never happen, by the way. You only set up the Pro Bowl if you made the Super Bowl. And sometimes, they used to play after the Super Bowl. So some guys would even go after the Super Bowl. But point being is like everyone played in the Pro Bowl. Now, all even though it's not even a real football game, they literally just go out there and like, I don't even know what they're doing now. I don't even watch the Pro Bowl, haven't for years. But now you have all these alternates and you get guys like Mitchell Trubisky have a Pro Bowl. It's like that's not a legitimate it's not a legitimate
No.
thing to look at. It shouldn't even be like you said, if it's part of the criteria at all, it probably shouldn't. Like if it is, it should be like 5% of the criteria. I probably just wouldn't. I would just throw it out. It's probably not useful to look at whatsoever.
No, you mean you bring up Mitch, which is a fantastic example, and then the one that comes to mind immediately for me was probably 2 years ago when Tyler Snoop Huntley
Yep,
was
Tyler
a
Snoop
Pro Bowler.
Huntley. Yep,
Was a Pro Bowler. And that's just, yeah, like at that point, the stat has to mean, yeah, it's a very good point that, yeah, people not participating, because if they don't go to, well, it used to be in Hawaii, but it's been Orlando, Vegas, wherever now. If they don't bother showing up, they don't count as a Pro Bowler, basically. Like you don't even, and so all these alternates get to now count as,
yeah.
Basically just like stacks it up where these guys are having like all these accolades of just being painfully average.
It's like the seventh best quarterback in the AFC gets to call himself a Pro Bowler because
Congrats.
the six guys in front of him didn't want to go do it. And
Literally.
so then they all get the Pro Bowl accolade. It's just like, okay, we'll just throw that out. It's completely irrelevant. But that's part of this. That's why we're talking about it, because it's like that's part of the current criteria and state of Hall of Fame. If you go to the Hall of Fame website, they mention Pro Bowls, which, to your point, it's like it's so hard to adjust for error and kind of show it in the criteria, but because it used to matter more, but now it just doesn't matter at all. So it probably at this point going forward, all these modern players, it should not be a part of the criteria whatsoever.
Yeah, completely agree. So we'll now move. Let's move a little bit more into what what our thoughts, what our criteria would be. I think let's start by chatting on our criteria, because that'll be a good segue into who would be in, who wouldn't be in, especially the current guys that most of the guys that aren't in right now or currently playing that get discussed a lot. So I'll let you kind of kick things off in terms of like what your main pieces of criteria would be for you in terms of putting a guy into the Hall of Fame.
I'll start with something we've already touched on, which this is a idea we've been talking about for a long time, Dakota, which is the peak. I'll call it the peak. Yeah. And that just means, were you ever a top 5 player at your position? And how long were you a top 5 player at your position? And in my opinion, depending on the position, you have to be a top 5, 3 to 5 player, I'll say, for at least 3 to 5 years. And that depends, like it all matters, because if you're the best player at your position for like 3 or 4 years, okay, I can see that case. I can see that case, because think about it, dude. Think about how hard it is to make the league. How hard it is to make the league, and then how hard it is to make a Pro Bowl or an All Pro. But to be considered the very best for a 3 to 5 year stretch, I think that matters so much more than longevity. Now, longevity would be a part of my criteria, but it would be lower on the list of the criteria. And then the new thing that I would add to my criteria, Dakota, is kind of what I've been talking about throughout the show, which is the perception of the player. The perception of the player matters at the time that they played, which is very hard to capture. But the Hall of Fame voters that are voting on it should easily be able to capture it. So, like, when they're voting, it's not a problem. It's more just so a problem when you're talking about it years down the line. I think the perception of the player matters. Like, like Ed Reed, Troy Polamalu, like for a safety example, it's like those are two guys that the perception was these are the best at their position. Like, it doesn't throw out the stats. I don't even need to look at the stats. The stats are pretty much irrelevant. The counting stats are irrelevant to me. How many interceptions they had are completely irrelevant. Ed Reed was probably the most feared defensive player in the league when he played. Like that, and that matters. And again, a guy who's a first ballot Hall of Famer, but that criteria should be applied to guys that are on the borderline, right? Guys that are questions like, should this guy get in or not? Well, did he ever meet this criteria? No, he didn't. It doesn't necessarily completely eliminate you, but it should be a big part of it, in my opinion. And then as far as like the number of guys, I think the easiest fix, like if you want to make a Hall of Fame that are truly the best ever, I love the way baseball does it. Baseball just votes in a certain number of players based on merit, not based on the quota. Like the NFL has been a quota for so long. Like we have to get this number of players in no matter what. Baseball has years where they don't induct a single player into the Hall of Fame because it's if they don't meet a certain voter threshold, they just don't get in. Now, I think some of like the voting in baseball isn't the best, like because they just go purely based on stats and things like that. But they're correct, like how they vote to get in, I think would be a great change for the Hall of Fame.
And then your point on perception in the modern era, we got tweets, we've got articles. Let's get a repository going. I'm not even kidding of like genuinely what the people said about a player. And like when they get inducted into the Hall of Fame now, that should be like a part of it. Of just like here's everything that was written from a
Yeah.
journalism perspective on this guy and said by other players as well, like the top 100 thing. I mean, I agree with pretty much all of that. You know, like the peak thing. You know, I think you could also look at it as like a how long you were at that for like a certain percentage of your career based on how, because then it varies. You know, if you're in the league for only 9 years, I kind of need you to have done it. You know, it varies based on how long you've been in the league, and also that weighs into a bit on the longevity side, which I agree with. Longevity, it's so tough because it's like I don't want to like punish guys for having long careers, but you being your body just staying healthier to me doesn't mean you're the best at playing football. You know what I mean? Like that wouldn't weigh as quite as much for me. It would be at the bottom. And then one thing I would throw in, you know, is on the accolade side again, because I'm looking at the Hall of Fame purely as you are an
And
individual, right?
mhm.
Like this is you as your career. And how many times were you a first team all pro? Obviously weighing that versus knowing the inconsistencies in that voting, but then the actual awards, which again, you know, you've pointed out and in the past could have been skewed as well. But like MVPs, offensive player of the years, defensive player of the years, did you win rookie of the year? Things like that would matter a lot to me, more than Super Bowls. And then it would also vary depending on the position, right? Like, you know, if you're a quarterback that did lead to Super Bowls and you were a part of that, because that comes back to the perception thing, right? Like, we know you were a key part in creating this, or you did elevate your team to do that. Like, that would weigh a lot for me. Um, but yeah, I completely agree too on the restructuring format. Like, it's unfortunate because I would vote to just tear it all down and restart. But
You just
obviously, you
start
can't do
kicking
that.
guys out.
Yeah, it's like the opposite. You go knock on the door and you're like,
Uh,
"Hey, man, I need that
I
jacket
need I
back."
need that jacket back. Yeah, dude.
Sorry, man,
That's
it's out. You're done.
I
But
wouldn't do that, but I mean, I think
I would love to is the thing, but it would you just
no.
can't. But I would love to do it because it has become the Hall of Very Good, and it will forever be stained that way to me. There's going to be guys that will ever forever be in there, and you know, obviously, as the league and the NFL continues to exist, like the as the pool of the best to ever play becomes larger, certain guys are going to slip down that rank, and it doesn't mean they shouldn't have got in at the time they played.
Again,
Um,
perception at the time of which they're
exactly.
playing. That's why that
So it's like,
matters.
yeah, exactly. That's why that matters so much, and the statistical output is just another factor there. But another thing I would have, you know, if we did tear it all down, I love your idea with the baseball thing. Like we should be at that now. We got all those old heads in, let's just vote and only, you know, whatever that threshold is in terms of votes or whatever that has to happen, only those guys get in. And let's have some years where nobody does. It's tough because I think you and I would also agree, like most years lately, there's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer in there. But let's let that happen more where it's either you're a first ballot Hall of Famer or we wait a while to get you in.
Hmm.
But what I would be an interesting idea, and I don't know if any other leagues or anything has this, but it would be intriguing to me to treat if you were to start from scratch, the Hall of Fame is just like an X amount of each position. And it's just like at any given point, you're either moved down or up when guys come in. Like, were you one of the best 10 to ever do this or 15, 20, whatever? That would also be very, very difficult and very unfair thing to do to people. But it'd be a
It
very
would.
fascinating way to look at the NFL of like, here are at any given point in time,
Yep.
These were the 15 best quarterbacks to ever play the game of football.
It is interesting because it can be so hard to debate, like
Yeah.
that 14th and
Yeah.
15th and 16th guy, like who stays in, who doesn't. I think that's a fascinating thing. I think that's something that we could possibly explore on the channel, is doing something similar to that. And I think that's what it's going to take, because it's a little bit unfair to make the current criteria so strict because the past criteria wasn't.
True.
That's kind
True.
of the problem with keeping the past criteria the way it was for so long, because you got a guy like Torrey Holt that's fighting to get in, who still hasn't got in, that should probably be in over some, like they let Drew Pearson in 2020 because, and this is no disrespect to Drew Pearson, but because they had been, stringing him along for so long. Like, he had been a finalist for so long. And it's like one of those things is like, okay, you eventually got in, we're going to let you in. But of course, Torrey Holt had a better peak and was a better, perception wise, was a better receiver than Drew Pearson was in his air. So that's the kind of thing that kind of makes it difficult. I think it's going to come down to, I think it's important for, especially in this day and age, like you mentioned, like social media and
Mm.
podcasting. This is what we're doing right now. It's like, I think it's important for people like us and people who cover the Hall of Fame to tell the story like it should be told. These are the guys that are the best ever. And it's going to be hard to, like, someone's going to have to retroactively go back and make that list and figure out who actually should have got in and who shouldn't. But I think it matters because it's like, again, when you're talking about like all-time great discussions, it's like, well, this guy's a Hall of Famer. It's like, well, this guy was really just a good player that should have really just never gotten in. Um, so yeah, I think that's, kind of where I would go with the Hall of Fame. I think, it's interesting to look at our criteria and pair it to, again, some of the guys that are eligible, about to be eligible, already in. There's some really interesting discussions. We probably won't get to all of them today. But maybe if people like this video and, we keep doing this, we can go into some more individual cases, like, and break down, like, should this guy actually be in the Hall or not?
Yeah, I would love to do that. So, anybody that tunes in, listens, leave comments, leave a like, let us know if you'd like to see more content like this. And you bring up a very good point about, like, it being unfair to modern players to have a different criteria than the guys in the past. And an interesting thing that kind of goes in line with that is, like, I think there would probably be a balance there of, like, I think it's safe to argue that modern modern athleticism, modern players are better than the 60s and 70s. Like, the good players today would have probably, some good players today may have been great back then. And so I think there's a balance between shrinking that criteria and using the excuse of, like, well, you're playing in an era where, like, there's so many more guys anyway. Like, I don't know. It becomes very interesting, but it's also unfair to them a little bit still. Where, like, Mike Evans back in the 70s probably would have been, like, the best wide receiver back then. So it is unfortunate for them of when they played and stuff to weigh into how they're perceived and
It's all
whatnot. But
it's also a tough
unfortunately, it's the game.
conversation. Yeah, it's the game, and it's a tough conversation because it's like, yes, if you took 2025 Mike Evans and you plopped him in a game in the 1970s, he would be the best. But it's also, I also don't like when people say that to a certain extent, because it's like, okay, but give the guys in the 70s the modern
Yeah.
technology, the training, the tape, everything
Yeah.
that Mike Evans is allotted today. It's like, okay, then I think things would change. I think that's why you can't do, that's why when people are like in baseball and call Babe Ruth a bum, it's like, well, if Babe Ruth had modern technology and modern training and things like that, I think he would be probably up there with the best in today's game. And that's why I've kind of in this discussion, which is really never something I've really come to the conclusion of. But I think, again, your perception matters so much, dude. Like,
Yeah.
did players at the time in the 70s say you were the best? Like, to me, and again, I try to be a historian of the game, and I try to go back and look at these things. pairing a guy like Lynn Swan versus Drew Pearson, who are both now considered in the same class of Hall of Famers, like they are. Now, Lynn Swan was a lot better and he got in a lot quicker, but that's the thing. If you go ask players at the time, who's a better player? I think you would get a consensus that Lynn Swan was a lot better. He just was. Um, and so that's the kind of stuff that matters more so than stats, so much over stats. And you bring up Mike Evans, which is a great point. It's like Mike Evans is a guy that I wanted to touch on quickly because that's a guy that
Yeah.
I think fans that listen now know. Obviously, he's currently playing. Mike Evans currently has 0 All Pro selections, first team All Pro selections. He has, I believe, he has 2 second team All Pro selections, 0 first team All Pro selections, a handful of Pro Bowls, which we don't really care about anyways. But remember, Dakota, let's not forget, Mike Evans will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. When Mike Evans, in a Week 18 game, was force fed to get to 1,000 yards, the first player ever, or excuse me, I believe he tied Jerry Rice for consecutive 1,000-yard seasons. People declared him a first ballot Hall of Famer because he was on a list with Jerry Rice because of an arbitrary stat cutoff in an era where there's more games and it's way more pass heavy. It's like, dude, come on. Like, let's grow a brain. And these are people currently covering the game. That's why, the perception thing is kind of tough. You have to have people like us come back and push back and say, listen, Mike Evans was never a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL. He just wasn't. At no point in his career was, dude, this is going to be controversial. This might be where we get into the hot take stuff. Agree or disagree? Odell Beckham's peak better than Mike Evans. At a point in time, Odell Beckham was considered a better wide receiver, and I don't even care about the stat. I don't even want to look at the statistics. I'm just going based on how tough is it to guard this guy? What is the perception of this player? To me, Odell Beckham has a better peak than Mike Evans did. No point were we saying Mike Evans is up there with Julio Jones, who he played alongside, or Antonio Brown, or even DeAndre Hopkins. Like, I don't even think he ever got in. And remember, D-Hop is 2013 class. Mike Evans is 2014. They basically came into the league at the exact same time. But no one's calling DeAndre Hopkins a first ballot Hall of Famer. There's literally no one in the world right now calling D-Hop a first ballot Hall of Famer. But if I asked you 4 years ago, what receiver would you take on your team, DeAndre Hopkins or Mike Evans? It's a unanimous, no question about it. I want DeAndre Hopkins over Mike Evans. No question about it. But since Mike Evans has met this just random threshold of 1,000 yards for X number of seasons, people have now declared him a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know if it is debatable in terms of the peak, because there was, and it's funny because it was literally at the beginning of Odell's career. Like, his first 3 seasons in the league, he looked like almost like Justin Jefferson level of like, this dude's about to take the league by storm, and then got hurt and things just kind of fell off a cliff from there. And then they went on that boat as well. And it was around the same time they went on the boat.
I mean,
everything
Odell single-handedly extended Eli's career. I believe that. Odell extended Eli's career.
But yeah, his peak without a doubt, and his ability to catch and everything. And then one thing too, and I don't want to come back to statistics because we just talked about that, but like, even when looking at Mike Evans, like, never hit 100 catches in a season. And he led the league in touchdowns. And again, I don't want to like underplay something for him, but it was in 2023 where the MVP threw like 24 touchdowns. Like, it was one of the least statistical output seasons for passing in like the last 2 decades almost. So he only led with 13, and he's never led the league in receiving yards. Like, it's just, again, that perception aspect. And it's weird because it's like perception of casuals versus perception of people who watch and understand the game a bit more. And that's not trying to like put us on a high horse, but like, when you watch the game of football, like, Mike Evans is just a consistent wide receiver, but he's not been the best at any point.
And he's really good. That's the thing. That's why, because it feels like I'm tearing Mike Evans down. It's like, no, Mike Evans has been really good and really consistent. And should he make the Hall of Fame in its current state? Yes, I will say that he should. Right. Yeah. first ballot Hall of Famer is insane, and that's where I'll kind of get in a little bit to my first ballot Hall of Famer thing. Um,
Yeah.
I think they should add a ballot Hall of Famer patch to the jackets because I think it means more. I think when you're a first ballot Hall of Famer, it means more. Now they don't always get that right, right? Terrell Owens it took him 3 ballots to get in. That's an absolute
Insane.
shame, complete shame. The same thing is going to happen to Antonio Brown, and it's all based on post career Antonio Brown. It's a complete sham. Any kids that watch this 20 years later, which there'll probably be none, but anybody who watches this 20 years later, just know Antonio Brown was the best wide receiver in the league when he played. And in a time where you're playing with some of the best ever, by the way, Julio Jones, Calvin Johnson, AB was the best in a given period of time, and he should be a first ballot Hall of Famer. So I'm not saying they always get that right, but they should. The first ballot Hall of Famers, for the most part, right? Like I have the list here: Darrell Revis, Charles Woodson, Peyton Manning, Calvin Johnson, Troy Polamalu. Me and you would agree those guys are all very, very. They deserved first ballot Hall of Famer. They did. They're guys that changed the game, best players in the league. Should be in the Hall of Fame without question and should be first ballot Hall of Famers. I just believe that they should be celebrated and at least they should be put apart from the rest of the Hall of Famers because in my opinion, it's the best way to show, okay, these are guys that truly make up the greatest players in league history.
Yeah, and that leads to something too from my perspective, which is kind of funny after everything I've said about like positions and everything. But I always lean the most into the best to do it, right? Like the best to ever play your position, the best at the time, and that's where like for me personally, Devin Hester not being a first ballot Hall of Famer was weird to me because like he's literally the best punt returner in NFL history. He just is. Like I don't care about his receiver career. I don't care about any of that. Like he was the best to ever do something, and in my opinion, that is first ballot worthy. I'd kind of throw Vinatieri into that same boat. I know he's a kicker, but he was the best to ever do something when he played. Um, and so, like with your point there, honestly, with the way that I view the Hall of Fame, I think what would honestly work the best for me is like if a guy is not worthy of being a first ballot Hall of Famer, they're probably not a Hall of Famer to me. You know, like if you aren't good enough to be said, this guy's got to get in on his first ballot, you probably just don't make it in for me. And I know that's super harsh, but like there's just a lot of guys who eventually get in, and it's where like a guy like T.O., though, to your point, like he would have been a first ballot Hall of Famer to me. Um, but there's a lot of guys who it took a while to get in that you probably just wouldn't.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go that extreme, but I agree with your general point. And
Yeah.
a guy I listen to that talks about the Baseball Hall of Fame a little bit. He says he's like, okay, I get the distinction between first ballot and second ballot. I appreciate that. I think they should be way harsher with first ballot over second ballot. But why
Yeah.
should you get in on your third ballot? If you didn't get in on your
Yeah.
second ballot, right? You had two
Come on.
chances to get in. What changed? What changed between that distinction? Because like I get it, first ballot Hall of Famer, it's another level. Another level down, it's just Hall of Famers. If you're a second ballot versus fifth ballot, nobody cares. It's the same thing. But why? What changed 5 years later? Like your perception didn't change. You didn't get another. You didn't get another touchdown catch. You didn't get another, sack or whatever. So it's kind of weird. It's like it's kind of weird to think, oh, this guy's been eligible for 10 years, but all of a sudden now we think he's a Hall of Famer. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the best players ever, I think first ballot is a really good criteria. Again, they don't always get it right. Julius Peppers was a first ballot Hall of Famer. That's pretty insane. Like I don't think like we ever our perception of Julius Peppers was ever like we just saw it done talking about Deacon Jones and how
Jason
he
Taylor,
changed the game.
another good example
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, exactly. Jason Taylor's another good example. We just got done talking about Deacon Jones, how he changed the game, how the perception of Deacon Jones is like this dude is one of the most terrifying guys in the league. I just don't think I ever heard someone say that about Julius Peppers. We grew up watching Julius Peppers. He was a really, really good player. But he's not one of the best. Or another modern example that people appreciate is JJ Watt. JJ Watt's peak was so good. I can't even underestimate, like overstate. He was his peak might be the greatest 3-year peak in NFL history for a defensive lineman. He was so feared, dude. I told you, I told this story on the quarter century show, but I'll say it again since some people might be watching this show and not that one. There was a game that the Colts were. I'm a Colts fan for anyone who doesn't know. There was a game the Colts were playing the Texans, division rival, and I truly believe if you take J.J. Watt off the Texans, the Colts win the game. J.J. Watt had a pick six in the game. I believe he caught a touchdown as a tight end in the game because that there was a little period where he was doing that as a tight end, and he was completely unblockable, dude. Completely unblockable. It was during the era where Ryan Grigson, the Colts GM, did not want to protect Andrew Luck, and
Nope.
dude, J.J. Watt was like totally unblockable for a period of time. That to me is like you compare a guy like that to Julius Peppers or Jason Taylor, who we just talked about. It's like it's totally different, man. And we grew up watching those dudes, right?
Yeah.
That's when we started falling in love with the NFL. So we were pretty in tune with the perception at the time. And nobody talked about Julius Peppers the way they talked about JJ Watt. They just didn't. Now JJ Watt's one of the greatest defensive players ever. And I'm not saying only like 5 defensive linemen should be in the Hall of Fame, but again, it's just like that's the kind of thing that you should look at when you're making a Hall of Fame.
And I want to throw out because like to your point about his peak, like the accolades too, statistics and accolades that JJ Watt had in a 4-year span. But there's really the 3 seasons. He had like a down year for him in it, where he only had 10.5 sacks and 22 tackles for loss. But he had 20.5 sacks, 39 TFLs, led the league in both, and won Defense Player of the Year, first team All Pro. Then had the slightly down year for him. Then he had 20.5 sacks again and 29 TFLs, which led the league, won his second Defensive Player of the Year, and actually finished second in MVP voting that year, which I think is something people forget about 2014, which is crazy.
Unreal.
And then he had 17.5 sacks and 29 TFLs again, led the league in both, another Defensive Player of the Year. Like that is just insane. And to your point again, it's like the perception and also just how actually good their peak was versus just longevity. And funnily enough, he actually had 12.5 sacks, which sack stats, they are where they are. But like he had 12.5 his last season before he retired.
That's insane. Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like if he stayed healthy, I mean, he was going to be a problem. Like that's the thing. I mean, Aaron Donald also retired in his peak, but yeah, man, it's just the perception of the player matters, what they did while they're like how people viewed them. But also going back to our point about PFF, like that PFF and other things like it will really help when we're evaluating edge rushers, because how many seasons has TJ Watt had more sacks than Myles Garrett? Myles Garrett is currently the most unblockable player in football. His perception around the league amongst people who follow football, people who cover football, and people who play football is Myles Garrett's the best defensive player in the NFL. I don't know what their sack totals are. I don't really care. But places like PFF will help us think, okay, how many pressures did they have? Which like pressures that should be in the criteria, like because pressures that's a down by down thing. Sacks only happen in a good season it happens 20 plays in an NFL season where defensive players are playing like 800 snaps in a given year.
Yeah.
It's like that's a very small percentage of plays, and do they matter? Yes, but pressures in a vacuum probably matter more because it's a higher volume. So sources like PFF will 100% help with that, and hopefully the current Hall of Fame and the people who vote on Hall of Fame start to use those kind of numbers and things like that to help them justify players getting in or not.
Yeah, 100%. Because yes, sacks especially are such a volatile statistic that is, and that's where PFF comes in handy as well, of like how dominant edge rushers actually are in creating a sack versus just getting handed one. And I think a good example of that is Harold Landry. As a Titans fan, watching him a ton, dude got a lot of what I would call cleanup sacks, where other people got pressure and or quarterbacks evaded into him. And it's like that sack is now a stat for him that helps boost his what is essentially his career accolades of a statistical output. But what he didn't actually do anything really to achieve that. So that's where PFF can be huge, and it'll be interesting to see as we continue with how big PFF start to have a role in all pro voting, like you pointed out, and things like. Will that start to weigh in a little bit with the Hall of Fame? So, got to shout out Daniel in the chat. He, got some Troy Aikman slander there.
Troy Aikman, hey.
I won't go that far either, but he's let it be said.
Calling Troy Aikman the what did he say? He needs to be in the Hall of the average at best.
Average at best. Yeah.
Troy Aikman's average at best, according to Daniel saying.
Yeah,
Interesting.
all Cowboys fans, I'll give you his home address. Um, but yeah, this is really fun discussion. Appreciate everybody that tuned in. I would love to do let us know, leave comments, like, share, do all that fun stuff. Subscribe, we appreciate all that. But yeah, leave comments and like, and let us know if you enjoy conversations like this, because I would love to dive deeper into who we would get in currently, because there's a lot of names like we didn't throw out that I think would be a lot of fun to talk about. Like a Von Miller, like a Khalil Mack, guys like that are really interesting conversations.
They are.
But a lot of fun nonetheless. Yeah, any closing thoughts as we wrap up here?
Yeah, man. I guess I'll just closing. It's interesting this upcoming class: Drew Brees, Philip Rivers, Larry
Mm-hmm.
Fitzgerald. I don't know why Google's telling me Julian Edelman's eligible. I don't care. Jason Witten, lot of and Frank Gore. There's a lot of upcoming Hall of Famers that are interesting. So maybe we make a in the off season or next season when they do the Hall of Fame voting and things like that, we can make a video breaking down who we think should get in, who y'all think we should get in, and we'll discuss all that. Should be fun, man. A lot of discussions around the Hall of Fame to be had.
I think that'd be a fun thing to do as long as we are on this show and we don't go bankrupt. That we will probably do that. We'll evaluate the Hall of Fame class too once we get there this fall. That'll be a fun thing to do with the guys that are getting in, reflecting on their careers and our thoughts on it, and then also immediately projecting what we think may happen with the next class. So I think that'd be a lot of fun. But yeah, thanks everybody again for tuning in or watching the vid. Appreciate all the support. Like, share, subscribe. We appreciate all that. But until next time.
Thanks for talking ball with us.